partnerships are nothing new to American politics, as we have seen thus far in the narrative of this podcast. But what happens when the domestic world and the political realm overlap? That's what we'll be exploring in this episode. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. As we've already seen in our narrative episodes, there are many famous political partnerships in American history prior to the Civil War. Certainly, Washington and Hamilton, as well as Jefferson and Madison, come to mind. However, we've also seen in the early days of Washington, D.C., where housing was scarce, that political colleagues sometimes lived under the same roof, such as Meriwether Lewis living in the executive mansion with Jefferson, or the Supreme Court all staying in the same boarding house. This intersection of the domestic and political worlds would have an impact on the political landscape and history of the United States for decades to come. And in this episode, I'm joined by a special guest to explore one of the most significant partnerships in American history. Dr. Thomas Balcerski earned a PhD in history from Cornell University in 2014. He is currently an assistant professor of history at Eastern Connecticut State University, where he teaches broadly across American history. His research interests include the antebellum period, the history of manhood, and presidential politics. His new book, Bosom Friends, The Intimate World of James Buchanan and William Rufus King, was published by Oxford University Press in 2019, and it is this book that we discuss in this episode. We had a great conversation about the politics, ideologies, and society of antebellum America, and not only how Buchanan and King fit into all of that, but what studying their lives and their relationship can tell us in turn about larger historical themes. Without further ado, let's get to the interview. Thank you for taking the time to join us, Tom. As we get started, I wanted to start by asking you, what originally got you interested in exploring the history of James Buchanan and William Rufus King's relationship?
I don't think I turned to them first, although their relationship became chapter one of the dissertation. I have to go back to a graduate seminar I took at Cornell University on 19th century America with Derek Chang, who gave us the freedom to pick a topic in history of the history of this period and to write about it, which is a lovely open-ended assignment. I actually wrote my first graduate paper on a 19th century history topic at Cornell on the F Street mess. And for those who don't know, they are a particularly infamous group of Southern senators who lived together in a boarding house in Washington, D.C. in the 1850s, and whose collective power gave them such influence that they were able to influence Franklin Pierce to agree to rescind or do away with the Missouri Compromise in the proposed Kansas and Nebraska legislation. So that's 1854. I was and have been always interested in antebellum history. Antebellum history has always intrigued me. The players involved always seemed freighted with such importance. The causes of the Civil War more generally, what brought our nation to fight brother against brother. Those are stirring topics. Those are things that draw at the heartstrings, that get you thinking about larger questions in American history, thinking how our history has relevance to the present. And when you broaden the tapestry of figures from the antebellum past, you can't help but look at the president at the time, President James Buchanan. He was president from 1857 to 1861. Buchanan is not an unknown figure. Pick up any book about the antebellum period, he typically has an entry in the index, and sometimes he gets more detailed treatment, other times he's something of a straw man, to which bad things seem to happen or bad decisions are made, but who is not a full fleshed out figure. And I might have kept him there. I mean, I might have focused on the legislative process and ignored the presidency in this period, as scholars sometimes do, simply because this is the period of the weak president. And Buchanan is weaker than many in our American history. But there was something about him that caught my attention, and that led me to then explore his previous political relationships, and then particularly that with William Rufus King. Namely, James Buchanan was a lifelong bachelor. And I began to realize that not only was I interested in antebellum politics and friendship and manhood, but bachelorhood. And I asked the question, just who else was a bachelor in the Washington, D.C. of this period? And I quickly learned from just a cursory sketch of Buchanan that indeed William Rufus King, a senator from Alabama, who was Buchanan's intimate friend, was also a lifelong bachelor. And from there, I had the first chapter of my dissertation, which was about a series of male friendships and how they related to the coming of the Civil War. And in preparing the dissertation for publication as a book, I decided to focus on that chapter, to make chapter 1 the focus of the book. And there it is. That's how I came to write Bosom Friends, The Intimate World of James Buchanan and William Rufus King.
It's amazing how one project can sometimes lead into another and lead into another. So before we dive into Buchanan and King, I was wondering if you could take a minute, because I think that one of the things we often hear that Buchanan and King lived together for a good period of time, but one of the things that you emphasize in your book is that there was much of that time that they were living with other messmates. So I was wondering if you wouldn't mind talking about some of the other messmates that that folks may not be as familiar with, but were pivotal to that relationship.
Great, yeah. In Bosom Friends, I was really, really pleased that my publisher permitted me the space to prepare 3 appendixes. And one is the Washington residences of James Buchanan and William Rufus King over the period 1834 to 1853. They did first live together in 1834, starting in the session that begins in December, congressional session, and extends to March, which is the end of the, congressional term, sometimes called the lame duck term, in what is a 2-year congressional term. Now, they were both in the Senate at that time, so although they were on 6-year terms, nevertheless, they followed that same 2-year cycle in terms of congressional meetings. So at the time, James Buchanan and William Rufus King also lived in the same boarding house, or messed, as a verb, with Bedford Brown, who was the senator from North Carolina, and Edward Lucas, who was in the House of Representatives from Virginia. Now, what they all share in common is that they were all Democrats. One, Buchanan was from Pennsylvania, but the other 3 men were from the South, North Carolina, Alabama, Virginia. And Bedford Brown was married, but the other 3 were not. So we can say in the first mess that it was largely bachelor, largely Southern. Later on, as the various boarding house configurations begin to change, Buchanan and King have one session where they do not live together. Then they're back together with a new cast of characters, including Robert Nicholas, who is another Southern Democrat. He's from Louisiana, also a bachelor. And in this mess, it's Buchanan, King, Nicholas, and Lucas, and the 4 of them are all bachelors. So we have now, for the first time, a bachelor's mess. And that's actually the phrase that Buchanan used in one of his letters to talk about the grouping. I knew that was significant because messes, the boarding houses of the time, often played a role in political identification and affiliation, in addition to a kind of personal identity. And so Buchanan's relationship to bachelorhood throughout his life is complicated, both in terms of how he saw himself as well as then how he's perceived politically. But some other bachelors of the mess include John Pendleton King of Georgia, and then later on we get William S. Ramsey, another bachelor. And then later on, we get William H. Roane, who's from Virginia. Ramsey was from Pennsylvania. And Nicholas, I mentioned already. And then the last man with whom they messed was, in the Congress, was Clement Clay, who was senator from Alabama, was married. They did at times have other members of the mess in them. It was difficult to try to determine just who else might be living in the same residence. At one time, John Catron, the Supreme Court Justice from Tennessee, was a part of a mess with King and Buchanan. There may have been other people not affiliated with the United States Congress who were in the same boarding house. But the primary source for this table I constructed primary sources were the congressional directories, some of which have been compiled and published in a book called the United States Congressional Directories, edited by Goldman and Young. And the primary sources themselves are these small pamphlet-style directories, which are available at the Library of Congress and on microfilm and at the Washington, D.C. Public Library. And then in addition to that, I supplemented my calendar here, or rather my appendix, I guess, with just reading the letters between them and picking up on any reference to other people who might have been living in the boarding house. So I was able to put together a pretty detailed list. And so I would say, with one interruption, Buchanan and King lived together while in Washington from December 1834 until King's departure for France as minister to France in April of 1844. So approximately 9 years and 5 months.
Well, and one of the points that you mentioned that was really fascinating to me in reading the book was this kind of confluence between the political life and the domestic life. And one thing in particular that caught my interest is that you mentioned how Buchanan's positions on slavery and the growing abolitionist movement in the antebellum period were shaped by his living situation with the bachelor mess. Would you mind sharing some of how that domestic space helped to shape his political life?
Definitely. In Bosom Friends, I try to divide the story chronologically. So I do proceed from the first year, which is William King's birth year in 1786, and I end technically with James Buchanan's death year in 1868. But the heart of the book is the period in which two men lived together, as just discussed. And it's really over that 9-year period that we see the most intimate contact between them and among their messmates. So it's important to establish that Buchanan, first of all, at this time was already a Jacksonian and was already a Northern Democrat. That being said, his political history before then was Federalist, and his change to Jacksonian politics took place in a heated moment in the election of 1824. So 10 years later, he's a committed Jacksonian. And so he already shares basic political principles with other Democrats. So William Rufus King, his fellow Democrat from Alabama, has more in common with Buchanan as a Democrat than, say, a Whig, or rather a National Republican or some anti-Jacksonian affiliation. The parties are messy at this time. So that's just the first of baseline. You've got two men now who have a baseline political affiliation, which is different than 10 years earlier, where the parties were in flux, where Buchanan sort of was an orphan Federalist, so that now partisan affiliation matters to a much greater degree, I would say. Issues that then come up. Now, this is the 1830s. This is the second term of Jackson. Much of the fire and brimstone rhetoric of disunion has already passed. That is to say, the nullification crisis, the veto of the bank charter, Second Bank of the United States. So by the time Buchanan comes to Congress in 1834, a lot of the most, I guess, divisive issues have sort of been settled for a time. And very quickly, the focus is put on the election of 1836, which is to say Martin Van Buren's presidential election. And it's within Van Buren's first year in office as president that we get the first major, I guess, political issue related to the panic or recession of 1837, which of course has to do with Jackson's veto of the bank and the withdrawal of federal funds or deposits from this now defunct Second Bank of the United States, a credit contraction, and then liquidity crisis, we might call it today. Buchanan then has to, I guess, step up to the plate, and he does. We see him now supporting the Senate's independent treasury bill, which was Van Buren's plan to sort of replace the Bank of the United States with this independent treasury. This is something of a natural progression for King, but not so much for Buchanan, who had been pro-bank previously. And you can see him sort of changing his tune in order to fit to the political wind. So I think the first, perhaps, and from his point of view, most freighted change may well be his view towards the bank and towards tariffs to a degree. He became anti-tariff, and that sometimes rubbed the manufacturing base in Pennsylvania the wrong way. But of course, slavery is the issue that we look back on in retrospect, and especially from the fulcrum of the Civil War that follows, and we tend to see it as being the dominant issue. That may not have been the case for Buchanan and King, at least initially. Certainly in the 1830s, Buchanan saw divisions over slavery as meddlesome and as potentially catastrophic for the Union, but was still in a kind of position of power, both within the Democratic Party and within popular opinion, let's be fair, to institute a procedural move that has come to be called the gag rule, in which petitions from abolitionists that were sent to the Congress, which would normally have to be read into the record, could be instead received and tabled, meaning they would not have to be read. And so the gag idea, meaning there's literally like putting a gag in the mouth, not being able to speak. And this essentially silenced debate in the Senate for a decade, till 1850. And at times Buchanan would not give a pro-slavery speech, is how I might say, but instead would support his Southern colleagues in their defense of sort of the protection of slavery at different points. King often served as president pro temp of the Senate, and so he didn't often speak, but when he did, it was often to support Buchanan in some way or to kind of second the motion. So I think those are some early moments where we see him hardening along what we would call pro-slavery lines, which is to say defending the institution of slavery, as well as along Jacksonian lines, particularly around economic policy. And there are other moments of it. I actually wanted, though, to do a more precise analysis rather than to pick out, as I've just done, the most high-level points. And so I did a roll call analysis, which is actually Appendix B of the book, to try to correlate Buchanan's voting patterns with his messmates, to try to see if we can come up with that, how strong a relationship or correlation was there, without slipping into causation and correlation debates. And within the various congressional meetings that Buchanan sat in with his messmates, we look at voting patterns in common. And I found that over the 9-year period described, he voted in common with William Rufus King, his primary messmate, 87.9% of the time. Certainly when it came to all the major legislation, we find them voting in common. They did vote differently around the edges, often around what we might call discretionary spending today. But for the most part, they had come to pretty much align. And the big issues, particularly economic and domestic slavery, there was a clear alignment at this time. So I've been challenged by readers to come up to really describe the relationship between Buchanan and King, and thus the boarding house as an agent of that relationship. And the word I've come up with might be a bit of a kind of a present tense view, but I use the word incubator. This idea that you put two people almost like chemical agents within a controlled environment, in this case, the house, and the reaction takes place. We can pinpoint certain moments where the influence of King on Buchanan plays out. It's harder in their boarding house life, quite frankly, because they didn't write as much to each other. And Buchanan's correspondence during his 10-year period in the Senate is sparser than I might like. But certainly, too, their relationship outside of the Washington boarding house in the years after 1844, where the correspondence does increase, shows more direct connections and influences.
From DNA testing to the Dixie Mafia, Crime Capsule brings you new stories of true crime in American history. I'm your host, Benjamin Morris. Join us for exclusive interviews with authors from Arcadia Publishing, writing the hottest books on the most chilling stories of our country's past. You can find us wherever you get your favorite podcasts or on evergreenpodcasts.com. Crime Capsule. History so interesting, it's criminal.
Well, and you mentioned during their time in the boarding house that they were working to position themselves as conservative leaders of the Senate. Can you speak for a moment about what conservatism looked like in the antebellum period?
It's a good question, and certainly relevant to our political understandings today. I think it's fair to use the word conservative, first off. I think liberal is a more difficult, perhaps, word to pin down as it's changed, I think, more so than conservatism. But conservatism, on the whole, is been easier, I think, to find within political history, which I think is something scholars are coming to point to more and more and talk about. So I think it's actually an area of interest today still. So I think conservatism in this case meant, number one, institutional conservatism. The idea that the Senate within the Constitution was the upper chamber. It had a kind of more reactionary duty to it. And so they saw themselves as conservative, institutional conservatives, in the same way I think that the House of Lords in its relationship within Parliament is to the House of Commons. So I think that's the first way in which they were truly the conservative body, as he said at one point. But also political conservatism, generally, we might think of it as being opposed to a number of issues that would fundamentally change the relationships within society. Certainly slavery fits within this paradigm of political conservatism at this time. For Southerners, for someone like William Rufus King, the institution of slavery, the plantation economy and society that had developed was to him the only kind of issue it's not the only issue, but is the most important issue that mattered to him, preserving that way of life, that balance, keeping the people in the hierarchy at the top. So customary relationships, those between social betters, those who conceived of themselves as being elite, that was sort of maintaining that those social relationships is also part of the conservatism of this period. You see it in just small ways. Buchanan dressed the same way pretty much his entire political life. He held on to outmoded fashions, as did King. Famously, too, this is political symbolism. Someone like a James Monroe wore the knee-high socks and breeches during his presidency, a kind of callback to the earlier revolutionary moment. So I think there is a way in which Jacksonian conservatism also stands in as a kind of politic, holding on to the political principles of the party of Jackson, even as times are changing, even as new issues come about. It's that commitment, which will later be, I think, correctly labeled stubbornness, that makes Buchanan at times an ineffective leader as president. But in terms of a creed, in terms of a commitment to constitutional principles, particularly around presidential power, executive power, these are conservative principles. These are principles that today we would call strict constructionism. Not quite originalism. I think that's a very problematic concept / phrase, but especially given Buchanan is not 200 years after the Constitution. So I would just say strict constructionism or strict reading of the Constitution, Jacksonian principles, commitment to the institution of slavery, the balance between northern and southern states, the federal system, the observation of so-called states' rights, all of that I think is a stew that defines the actual practice of conservative politics. Now, one could get into the philosophy of conservatism at this time, and I think someone like Edward Burke comes to mind as being important, as an influential figure to both Buchanan and King. Michael Connolly has written a wonderful article about Burke's influence on Buchanan. So there were so-called conservatives coming from the UK, actually, from Britain, who were in a more centuries-old tradition of what we would call today liberals and conservatives, but they had different names, Tories and Whigs. And so perhaps I think still within American conservatism, there was a kind of philosophical leaning towards what was being done overseas. So I think there's that too. We don't have a lot of original conservative thought at this time. John Calhoun, in his final works, his Disquisition, is considered a conservative mind, but at the same time, there's always that sort of the radical element that slavery demands. So someone like Calhoun, who is otherwise an American conservative, nevertheless, in his final works, is calling for a dual executive, for a major modification of constitutional principles so as to protect the institution of slavery. Abel Upshur, who was the Secretary of State killed in the explosion of the Peacemaker gun on the Princeton in 1844, whom Calhoun replaced, he was a conservative. He's been, I think, rediscovered by modern conservatives to be one of their own. And Upshur's reply in the Senate is cited, or is it the House, I think. So it's primarily, honestly, Southerners in this period who get a lot of attention as sort of American conservatives, but there's a tainting, I think, to this conservative philosophy around the issue of slavery that does not jive with modern conservatism. Because again, although there might be a commitment to class relationships and to economic order and things of that nature today, only in the most disgusting, distasteful circles does anyone, I think, want to talk about racial hierarchy and sociobiology and just a number of really just bad things that these guys all believed in, to be honest. So, I mean, 19th century conservatism was deeply what we would call today white supremacist, hierarchical, and yet it can't be divorced from the rhetoric of conservatism, political conservatism, which Buchanan could embrace unproblematically.
Absolutely. And I think you make a good point of this connection through the threads of conservatism over the course of history, this preservation of the current norm. That seems to be kind of that common thread that goes through, but then there are these variations, and especially you look at the writings and the speeches of Southern conservatives in the antebellum period, and it's very harsh language, and I think language that most people who identify as conservatives nowadays would not in any way, shape, or form condone. But
yeah. And yet, like I said, Upshur, I was just trying to remember what it was Upshur's view of the Constitution. He printed it as a pamphlet in his reply to Judge Joseph Story. And it's a work that has been overlooked in its time, a brief inquiry into the nature and character of our federal government. So it's thinkers like this that from the 19th century, Calhoun, Upshur, a few of them, that are, I guess, part of this intellectual lineage. But yeah, there's a kind of at arm's length relationship, I think, to 19th century conservative thinkers in American history, because it's primarily around maintaining the institution of slavery within the Southern way of life.
Well, thank you for that. Kind of turning our conversation a little towards more of the personal aspects of your book, I was wanting to see, what can you tell us about Buchanan's attempts at love and how that compared to social norms at the time, especially with men in politics? That was really a fascinating part of your book.
Buchanan was, I think, a partial romantic. I say that after struggling for years here to truly understand how he felt about women, and about courtship, and about romantic love. I think he was a cynical romantic. I think he played the game once. He did it poorly, and he was scarred. I think that scarring healed, and yet I think he was clever and shrewd enough to know how to hold on to the value of that past romance, to say nothing of present flirtation and courtship. Allow me to explain a little bit. So famously, Buchanan, the Bachelor. Perhaps as famously, Buchanan was once engaged to marry. Her name was Anne Coleman. She was, at 24, herself something of a borderline case of being past the traditional or societal age or socially acceptable age of marriage. Buchanan was a bit older than she. He was considered Lancaster's most eligible bachelor. She was the wealthy daughter of an iron magnate, Robert Coleman. Their engagement was thought to be a good match, probably more so for Buchanan, who stood to inherit the wealth of the Coleman family in time. And yet Buchanan, a busy lawyer, a prominent lawyer in Lancaster, constantly traveled back and forth between Philadelphia and other parts of the state to practice law. And in the course of their engagement, he neglected Anne Coleman. There was one incident where he came back to Lancaster and paid a call at a friend's house, and another married woman was present. Word got back to Anne Coleman, who broke off the engagement in haste, who just felt that neglect had been too great. She then travels to Philadelphia to try to lift her spirits, only to, in December of 1819, die of what her physician described as hysterical convulsions, most likely a opiate overdose. So Buchanan now had a broken engagement, and his ex-fiancée has died of what we would probably consider a drug overdose today. Did not look good, no matter how you splice that. And he was somewhat socially ostracized in the moment. Now, if you take his autobiography that he wrote, or his autobiographical sketch seriously, and I do, And he says that this is the impetus that drove him back into politics. And he'd previously been in the legislature of Pennsylvania as an assemblyman, but he had not yet jumped into national politics. And following Ann Coleman's death, he does so and is eventually elected to the U.S. House of Representatives, thus putting him on the course towards a career in politics nationally. And all during that time, he is close with female friends. He is talking about marriage and how he presumes he will need to marry. There's at least 3 instances I find where he was seriously looking into marriage. All 3 do not end in marriage, quite obviously. And the explanation has to be given that he was also a family man. He was one of several children in the Buchanan family, but of the 2 sisters that lived to marry, both had children of their own, and both sister and husband will die prematurely, leaving their children in the care of the Buchanan family. And Uncle James will become a kind of surrogate father, particularly 2 of these children, Harriet Lane and James Buchanan Henry, his namesake, so the Lanes and the Henrys. And Phil Klein, who's the biographer of Buchanan, and I think that has the deepest understanding of James Buchanan for all sorts of reasons. He was from Lancaster himself. He's worked in Penn State. He had access to archives that seemed to have disappeared. But Klein basically comes up with the idea that Buchanan was a so-called bachelor father. And you think about it. Here's a man who's danced around courtship, who's been brokenhearted once, who has familial obligations, and then, yes, he could marry. I mean, he could have married at 40, 50, 60, even 65 was not out of the question. Even the year he was elected president, James Buchanan could have married. That he didn't tells us, I think, more about his own decision than to not marry because of family reasons than anything else. Now, this gets into just all sorts of counter arguments that are almost unanswerable, which is to say that people want to read in Buchanan's inability or lack of desire to marry as having not what we might call the sexual passion or the heterosexual passion for women. To be honest, there's no disproving that argument. And part of what I've tried to do in this book is to try to lay out sort of the kind of problem of James Buchanan's sexuality and to sort of use friendship as a kind of entry point into that relationship, because there's been a logical slippage from saying, okay, Buchanan never married, Buchanan had a failed engagement, to then saying, well, that must mean his relationship with men therefore became his sexual kind of outlet. And then it's another leap to then say William Rufus King therefore becomes that person. And when we look to the gossip of the period, when we look to the surviving evidence, we find things like Mr. Buchanan and his wife. And so it really is one whole messy ball of wax to talk about Buchanan's romantic life, to talk about his connection to women, and then, as has been done lately, his connection to men.
I think you make some really great points about that, and really trying to lay out and examine the facts and where more modern interpretations have taken leaps that maybe aren't necessarily justified in the record. And I really enjoyed how you discussed these gender roles and how gender roles really came into play, and even in the political sphere. So turning to the other main figure in Bosom Friends, you mentioned how King was referred to as Aunt Nancy or Miss Nancy by some of his political opponents. Would you mind talking about the context of that characterization in terms of the time period and the impact, if any, that it had on King?
So William Rufus King is the lesser known figure of the pair. We know from his biography he was born in North Carolina near Fayetteville and spent most of his early adulthood there. He rose to power politically quite early on. He was among the youngest ever elected to the U.S. House of Representatives. He attends the University of North Carolina. Before that, gets his start in politics, also as a plantation owner, an owner of slaves, and eventually in the Great Relocation to the South West, what is today the Southeast, he will end up as one of the founders of the town of Selma, Alabama, where he establishes a similar kind of plantation lifestyle, mostly absentee as he's in Washington and abroad and so forth. So William Rufus King is a genteel Southerner. He is someone who, like Buchanan, has a lifelong relationship to bachelorhood, and to a lesser degree, I think, let me rephrase this. To a greater degree, a more problematic relationship to women. Whereas Anne Coleman is a documented courtship, William Rufus King never has a documented courtship. He claims at a few points in his life that he loved once and could never love again. And he's referring to a woman who was never really available to him. Princess Charlotte, the wife of the future Tsar Alexander, and so she will become a Tsarina herself, an empress later on. This claim to have loved this soon-to-be Russian Tsarina is far-fetched, to say the least, and it is not really supported in anything other than family legend, which is to say probably what William Rufus King himself spun. And even some of the family members who later on, would tell these stories about their uncle or great uncle, seem to know that it's a bit far-fetched and says they're not sure if it's true, but it's a good story. But the fact that that's like the baseline here, King throughout his lifetime could say, I've loved, I can never love again. Later on, generations of nieces and nephews will see their uncle in action at different times and will basically claim that they think their uncle, William Rufus here, is a ladies' man and just sort of gets the attention of the ladies, and he may marry one day, but he seems to instead be allowing the women to sort of go to the younger men. So he takes on an avuncular role as a kind of, as his nephew says at one point, a godfather to his countrymen. And he's very comfortable in that role. So whereas Buchanan is flirty and seems to play with women, King doesn't. He sort of knows the appropriate relationship to women, and he doesn't for him, and he doesn't pass it. He doesn't transgress that line. So this leads me to sort of see King as not playing the game of romantic courtship, as uncomfortable. Even in his friendly relationships with women, he's a favorite of certain women, but he does seem to be more comfortable in the presence of men. So he's the lesser known of the two figures for a reason. He was vice president, yes, so you'd think we would know something about him, but it's also because his personal papers are so few and far between. He's a harder person to really get to know. He's more enigmatic versus Buchanan, and that's saying something because Buchanan was quite buttoned up and only rarely revealed his true feelings.
Absolutely. And it was interesting because that is one of those things that we don't really think that much about. What we know about figures from history is dependent on what sources we still have. And I really enjoyed at the end of the book where you talked about the many ways that his papers could have been in some way, shape, or form were lost to us over time. So it ends up we really do depend on kind of other people's impressions and what scattered resources we can still find to get an impression of King. And it was interesting because you've got this idea that he was referred to as Aunt Nancy or Miss Nancy. But then also you detail numerous occasions where he engaged in duels, like for case in point, it really, I was familiar with these because the 1 month presidency of William Henry Harrison is one of my personal passions in history. You mentioned the two duels that he nearly had in that point with William Seaton and with Henry Clay. What impressions did you take away from those duels and how that fit into the the Aunt Nancy, the Miss Nancy, how he was perceived in public and what that really meant for him, if you were able to glean anything from that.
Yeah, I wanted to get to the actual use of the names Aunt Nancy and Aunt Fancy. So Andrew Jackson is often credited for ascribing that nickname to King. And I have tried to see if it's in writing anywhere, but it's not. I've gone so far as to consult with the editor of the Jackson Papers, and after that consultation, I've come to the realization that it's something like so much with Andrew Jackson. It's a phrase that was attributed to Jackson as having said it. So he likely did say it, but we don't actually find it in the writing of Jackson. So that's why I say Jackson called King Miss Nancy, not. So if you go into the citations, it's not clear in what way he was called that. But newspaper correspondents did refer to King as Miss Nancy in their publications, but this was from anti-Jackson, or we might say proto-Whig publications. So it's actually more complicated. It's almost as if, and this is my guess, is that the opposition party was the first to belittle King in this gendered language of insult. And ironically, Jackson probably picked it up from there and then put it onto King. So I actually don't think Andrew Jackson is the origin of the insult. That's my own take. As far as some of the other gossip circulating about them, I think it's important to note that, again, it comes from rivals within the Democratic Party, but it comes within private correspondence. So we have come as historians to rely, I think, unduly on a few pieces of evidence that survive from this period. And one of them is a private letter from who will become the governor of Tennessee, a Jackson supporter, and then later a Polk supporter, Aaron Brown. Aaron Brown wrote to Sarah Childress Polk, the wife of James Knox, in 1844, as the race for the vice presidency ramped up. And he wrote at that time in a letter that's been much cited, Mr. Buchanan looks gloomy and dissatisfied, and so did his better half, until a little private flattery in a certain newspaper puff, which you doubtless noticed, excited hopes that by getting a divorce, she might set up again in the world to some tolerable advantage. Now, again, context. He's writing political gossip to the wife of a politician whom, as we know from Amy Greenberg's excellent new book about Sarah Polk, was able to utilize this political gossip to advantage on her husband's behalf. But the gendering here is interesting. It's Mr. Buchanan, his better half, and then ... she might set up again. So he doesn't name in this sentence King, but there's a reference earlier to him. And what's interesting is the marriage here, Mr. Buchanan and his wife, is a reference to the political fortunes of the Buchanan-King ticket in 1844. And whereas Buchanan had withdrawn from the presidential race to allow Van Buren to be nominated in 1844, King had not withdrawn from the vice presidential nomination. So this divorce that he's using, this insult, is a way of actually saying King is now going on his own to try to get the vice presidential nomination with Van Buren. Now, we know, in fact, that Polk emerges as the first dark horse candidate, although that's a debatable kind of moment, and then will not hold on to King as his vice president. Indeed, ironically, George Dallas, Buchanan's major Pennsylvania opponent, will become vice president. But it's a complicated world. It's a world of people competing for high political office. So the fact that we see gendered language here it's just not surprising. It's par for the course. That gendered language of insult will appear over and over with King, again, is not surprising. It certainly points to a view of him as more feminine, as particularly when compared to Buchanan, as we might say, the missus or the woman in the relationship. And it was easy to make them gendered in that way. What's interesting, of course, is Buchanan is also taken to task in his politics at various times. He is made in 1848 in one cartoon I found to be a spinster, but so was Martin Van Buren and Polk and even Levi Woodbury. When he ran for president in 1856, his bachelorhood was belittled and taken to task. But it's really only as president when, during the period of the breakdown of the Democratic Party, the secession crisis, that we see a magazine like Vanity Fair start to sketch Buchanan wearing a dress and as a woman. And it's that final year of his presidency where he is, I think, most harshly criticized in the language of gendered insult. And it kind of comes full circle in a way. I mean, he's already almost 70 years old. He's an old man, overwhelmed by his times. And again, Vanity Fair turns him into a woman to sort of unman him in that moment. So gendered insults were used certainly against Buchanan and King. They were used against politicians of all stripes. There's so many fun and colorful insults from this period that we find. And I would just point out that Buchanan and King also belittled their political opponents. They did not use the phrase Aunt Fancy, Aunt Nancy. They may have been more sensitive to gendered insults, given that they were on the receiving end of it. I don't find it in their correspondence, but I do find insults of other kinds.
Absolutely. And it is that it gets back to that idea of just how passionate and virulent politics were at the time, something that I think you really laid out and helped to kind of break through the layers of that complicated political and social landscape of the time. As our time is drawing near, I wanted to ask you, what are you working on now, and where's your research taking you from here?
This book project certainly has been very important to me, and even in the last several months since publication, I found myself still thinking about it and talking about Buchanan and King, but also thinking about the presidency and about the Democratic Party. As I came to reflect on my book project, I realized that I was also interested in how this party, this Democratic Party, came into being, how it supported people like Buchanan and King, and how it continues to be the oldest political party in American history and, by extension, world history. And so I'm pleased to know that scholars have written histories of the Democratic Party. There were a few that came out in the 1990s that were a bit of importance, but actually I was surprised that although there's been a resurgence of partisan history about the Republican Party, a couple excellent books in the last few years, there's been no recent history of the Democratic Party that considers the party in totality and that essentially takes stock of how the party has gone wrong and right. And I've been struck by how in popular circles and in particularly right-wing media, we see the Democratic Party as being sort of wrong on issues, and it's become kind of an attacking point. Then we've seen on the left, particularly in academic circles, a kind of waving of the hand, whereby people just say, oh, everything you knew, everything about the Democrats and the Republicans in the 19th century, just switch, as if like somehow that answers flattening complexity is the answer. So I have come to see a need for a history of the Democratic Party from origins to present that doesn't necessarily engage in either trap, which is to say the hand waving that the Democrats and the Republicans are somehow just switched in their politics in the 20th century, and doesn't engage in, you might say, the whitewashing of the Democratic Party's past. I would like to write a book that, in a way, is a presidential synthesis, yes, or really a synthesis of presidential campaigns. So I already know that means it's going to get largely ignored in academic circles, so be it. But that actually looks at the financing of the party, so maybe there is a contribution still. Because I think that's one part that's overlooked, is who's actually paying for these campaigns. And today in our landscape of PACs and super PACs and big donors and self-financed billionaire campaigns, we sometimes forget that these parties often went broke in the 19th century. And one of the ways that they could assure their solvency was to actually appoint their largest donors as like vice president. And it's incredible the number of vice presidential candidates through the years who were just like the big fat cats of the party. So I'd like to look again how money plays a part in our partisan politics historically, how issues do in fact change, how sectional tensions played a part, how surprisingly procedural issues were often some of the most important debates within party history, how manhood and bachelorhood plays a role, because the Democratic Party nominated 3 bachelors in this period. Buchanan was the first, but then Samuel Tilden in 1876, and again, Grover Cleveland in 1884. So I think it's interesting, too, how a certain kind of manhood led the top of the ticket often in the Democratic Party. So those issues aren't going away for me. I am a 19th century historian by training. So, I mean, at one level, it might be a smarter move to sort of stop with someone like William Jennings Bryan, who I know something about from my reading. But I think this is a book that's going to push me to go into the 20th century and beyond and to learn a new historiography, which I'm excited to do. I've always been a fan of Franklin Roosevelt ever since I was a kid, so I somehow know a lot about him. But yeah, it's going to require me to read more broadly, to think in more holistic terms. I've begun to shift my teaching a bit in this way. I've started to teach a class called U.S. Presidents and First Ladies. I'd like to teach a special topics class on the history of the Democratic Party. And broadly speaking, try to bring American history to the present day is one of the things I now do in my survey classes. So I don't know, maybe it aligns with my view of how politics should and can be relevant. And so I look forward to seeing where this book takes me. For now, I have a working title. It's called The Party of No, When the Democrats Were Conservative.
Well, it definitely sounds like you've got your work ahead of you. And I know, speaking for myself, and I imagine the audience as well, that we will very much look forward to seeing what you come up with.
Thank you, Jerry.
And thank you for joining us, Tom. Thanks so much again to Thomas Balcerski for joining me and for the wonderful conversation. I'll be eagerly looking forward to his future work. In the meantime, I hope you'll consider picking up Bosom Friends and giving it a read. Believe me, there are many more insights there than we had time to cover in this episode. I've posted links to some other interviews that Tom has done, as well as a couple of C-SPAN appearances on the website at presidencies.blueberry, that's BLUBRRY.com. On there, you'll also find various ways to subscribe to this podcast, as well as past episodes, including not only interviews with other historical scholars and authors, but also the narrative series examining each presidency in depth one at a time. For those who are new to the podcast, since I began in January 2017, I've gone through the presidencies of George Washington and John Adams, and am now in the middle of the series on Jefferson's presidency. It may be a bit before I get to Buchanan, but I hope you'll stay along for the journey. Before we go, I'd like to give special thanks to my husband Alex for helping with audio editing for this episode. As my schedule has been a bit more pressing than normal, I could not have gotten this episode out in time without his assistance. Finally, I'd like to thank you, dear listener, for joining us. If you're not already, I hope you'll follow me on social media, where I can be found on Facebook at Presidencies, on Twitter at Presidencies89, and on Instagram at Presidencies Podcast, all one word. Until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.
From DNA testing to the Dixie Mafia, Crime Capsule brings you new stories of true crime in American history. I'm your host, Benjamin Morris. Join us for exclusive interviews with authors from Arcadia Publishing, writing the hottest books on the most chilling stories of our country's past. You can find us wherever you get your favorite podcasts or on evergreenpodcasts.com. Crime Capsule. History so interesting, it's criminal.